Hey guys, tonight we're diving into shockingly taboo jobs in 18th century Europe, from grave diggers to sewage workers and more. And no, it's not cute. It's weird, it's wild, and you probably wouldn't last 10 minutes without crying or getting fined in barley. So imagine this, it's the 18th century, you're walking down the street, and there's a distinctly pungent smell in the air. Is it the bakery? Nope. It's the freshly dug graves at the local cemetery. Yeah, you heard that right. Grave digging wasn't just a one-off job for funeral homes. It was an actual career. And trust me, the only thing more unpleasant than the stench of decomposing bodies was the fact that the guy doing the digging had to deal with it all day, every day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Now, let's break this down. Grave digging sounds grim, right? But here's the thing, in the 18th century, Europe was full of bodies, like everywhere. People didn't live to a ripe old age, and funerals were happening constantly. You think they had enough cemeteries for all those dead folks? Nope. So, what did that mean? Grave diggers had to work overtime, digging pits, pulling out bodies, and making space for the next unfortunate soul. But here's the real kicker. When it came to your job as a grave digger, you weren't just digging holes. Oh no. You also had to prepare the body. That's right. Imagine touching a decaying corpse, day in and day out, while you scrape off dirt and grime from the grave, just to toss it aside and prepare a fresh spot for the next victim. Talk about a job you'll never forget. Because, well, you couldn't escape it. It followed you home. Always. Historians still debate whether grave diggers in the 18th century were fulfilling their civic duty or if they genuinely enjoyed their job. Some claim that grave diggers played a crucial role in society by maintaining order and preventing cemeteries from becoming overcrowded. In contrast, others think they just took the job because it paid better than cleaning horse poop. Personally, I think both are true, and here's why. You didn't exactly choose this line of work because of the intrigue. People avoided it like it was a maggot-infested corpse, because, well, it usually was. You were in charge of making sure people had their final resting place, but at the same time, you could easily end up shoveling dirt on top of someone else's relative, who could have been your cousin for all you knew. But the thing is, being a grave digger wasn't just a job, it was also a life. Let's talk about the human aspect of this job. Imagine being surrounded by death all day, every day. And we're not talking about some gothic fantasy of digging a grave by candlelight in a misty graveyard. No, we're talking about digging graves in a busy, overcrowded cemetery, likely right in the middle of town. The smell alone would make you want to vomit, but guess what? You'd probably get used to it, too. That's what the job required, adaptability. The bodies would pile up, and you had to keep moving, digging, lifting, and carrying corpses around like they were just another object to put in the ground. You weren't even given the luxury of time to mourn the poor souls you were helping send off into the afterlife. For you, this wasn't about peace. It was about getting the job done before the subsequent burial arrived. Now, the most gripping thing about being a grave digger was probably the morbid fascination with death. Did grave diggers ever think about how weird it was to be so intimately connected to death? Historians debate whether these workers felt a certain detachment from the bodies they were dealing with, or whether it was just too much to handle. Some say that the constant exposure to death made them numb, kind of like how you can get used to the smell of garbage if you live next to a landfill. Others argue that grave diggers were so deeply involved in the mysteries of death that they probably got curious about it. Maybe even started wondering what the hell would happen to their own body when the time came. Can you imagine having a job like that? You're literally living in a perpetual state of, this could be me one day, while you're digging up other people's remains for a paycheck. You can't exactly enjoy a pleasant stroll through the park when you're literally shoveling dirt on top of a freshly disemboweled corpse. That's your Monday morning. And you can forget about taking a break at the local bakery on the way home, because the people in the bakery probably have some serious concerns about the smell that you're emitting. One thing's for sure, grave diggers didn't precisely get the red carpet treatment. While the noble class was getting their own servants to mourn them when they eventually kicked the bucket, the grave diggers were the ones left behind to clean up the mess, literally. They were the invisible backbone of society, never celebrated for their work, and barely noticed. The only recognition they got was the occasional thanks from a family member, but that probably didn't make up for the fact that you'd just been buried up to your knees in a filthy job. So, what could you do as a grave digger? Well, you could earn a living, but good luck with your sanity, your health, and your social life. You'd get a job in a place where the smell of death clung to your clothes like an uninvited guest, always there, but never truly acknowledged. You'd probably get paid decently, but at what cost? Was it worth living in the shadows of the dead, your life defined by what was left of the departed? Historians debate whether the pay outweighed the emotional toll of working in such a grim profession, but one thing's sure, being a grave digger in the 18th century was the ultimate test of endurance, and definitely not a job for the faint of heart. So, you've survived the grim life of a grave digger, and now you're asking yourself, could it get worse? Oh, sweet summer child, if you think that, buckle up. We're about to wade right into the literal filth of 18th century Europe, where sewage workers made a living shoveling. Well, let's say, it wasn't the kind of dirt you can wash off easily. Welcome to the world of sewage workers, those unsung heroes who spend their days up to their knees in muck and human waste. Forget the golden age of luxury and fine wine. Sewage workers got to experience the kind of classic European living that would make any modern-day plumber quit in horror. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Imagine this, you're in the heart of a bustling European city, and the streets are filled with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and who knows what else. You're a sewage worker, and your job is to dig through all of it. If you thought your job was challenging because of deadlines, try doing it while constantly worried that you might step into something that'll ruin your entire existence. These workers had one goal, to keep the sewage systems, what little there were, from completely collapsing. Back then, cities didn't have the luxury of modern sewage pipes. No, they had the classic, super charming open pits, drains, and overflowing cesspits. Think of it like a giant public toilet, except, instead of flush toilets and sanitation, you had to dig it out physically. And to make the mental image worse, the workers didn't get fancy gloves or face masks to keep themselves safe. Oh no. Just a damp, muddy trench, a shovel, and maybe a scarf around their nose if they were feeling extra cautious. Historians still debate whether this job was as horrific as it sounds, or if the sewage workers became accustomed to the smell and accepted it as part of their livelihood. Some believe that sewage workers were actually highly valued. After all, they were keeping the city's waste from overwhelming everyone else. But others suggest that these workers were seen as outcasts, forced into a job that no one wanted because it was too disgusting for even the lowest classes to consider. Either way, their work was gross, dangerous, and probably not the kind of thing you would write home about. And, for the record, those who worked with sewage weren't exactly getting invited to dinner parties. Trust me, you weren't exactly looking like a fashion icon after spending the day swimming through the city's waste, so there was no room for good times. Your lucky reward was earning just enough to get by, and probably showering off your filth with cold water, if you had the luxury of a bath in the first place. But let's take this one step further. These workers weren't just wading through filth, they were literally at risk of contracting diseases that could wipe out entire neighborhoods. We're talking the plague, typhoid, dysentery, the list goes on. It wasn't just about being dirty, it was about putting your life on the line to prevent a literal health crisis in the middle of a crowded city. And unlike today's sanitation workers, who receive various safety protocols and medical benefits, sewage workers in the 18th century had none. If you got sick, you were on your own. If you got infected and died, well, good luck finding someone to take your place. The job didn't get easier, it just got worse the more the population grew. And here's the wildest part, some workers had to clean the sewage systems by hand, and by hand, I mean with their actual hands. Historians still debate whether this was merely the most exaggerated claim of the time or a legitimate part of the job. Still, considering how little sanitation systems were maintained, it is likely that some sewage workers were literally up to their elbows in human waste. We're not talking cleaning up some spilt coffee. We're talking about deep dives into rancid muck that had been rotting for who knows how long. Everything, from food scraps to human excrement and dead animals, probably washed up in those systems. Imagine working with that all day. And you'd better believe that even the toughest workers weren't exactly walking away with glowing reviews from their co-workers after they clocked out. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on your perspective. Sewage workers didn't just deal with physical filth, they were constantly exposed to toxic fumes. Now, imagine not only having to wade through literal piles of waste, but also being surrounded by gases that could knock you out if you weren't careful. The 18th century had no modern understanding of the dangers posed by those fumes. If you worked in an underground sewage system, you might find yourself breathing in gases that would slowly poison you over time. You weren't exactly living your best life down there, my friend. Historians continue to debate the socio-political status of sewage workers. Some think they were outcasts, forever marked by their profession and treated with disdain by the rest of society. In contrast, others argue that they were seen as necessary but unappreciated workers. Either way, no one was exactly lining up to be their best friend. They were doing the dirty work no one else wanted to do, but no one was singing their praises either. So, what could you do as a sewage worker in 18th century Europe? Well, you could survive by diving into literal filth to keep the city from falling apart, until the plague got to you first. You could earn enough to buy the bare essentials, but what about your wealth? Not even close. You weren't exactly living like royalty after handling raw waste all day. You weren't going to become a famous historical figure either. You were just another guy trying not to get drowned in poop while making sure the streets didn't turn into even worse cesspits. Alright, was sewage work bad? Welcome to the bloodletting business. In the 18th century, doctors lacked the sophisticated diagnostic tools we have today. They didn't know the first thing about germs, but they did know that when you were sick, the best course of action was to make you bleed. That's right, bloodletting was the go-to treatment for just about everything. Feeling under the weather? Bleed out the bad humors. Got a headache? Better bleed out that headache. Had a cough that wouldn't go away? Here's the leech. Now lie down and get drained. This magical practice was ubiquitous, and it was a profession that showed no regard for modern science or one's well-being. Before we dive in, hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and time. Bonus points if you're pretending to work and secretly binge-watching history's most gruesome job descriptions. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Let's talk about leeches, shall we? These weren't your average backyard pests. Oh no. These were your fancy medical equipment, imported from the finest swamps across Europe. If you were lucky, you got to use real leeches, the kind that would attach to your skin and suck out the bad blood. Otherwise, you were stuck with the second-rate ones that barely even attached. The job itself? Well, it wasn't exactly a glamorous one, let's put it that way. You weren't exactly throwing parties for your guests after giving them a good old-fashioned bleed-out. Instead, you were just a doctor's assistant, running around grabbing leeches, making sure they were healthy, which, by the way, was a job way grosser than you think, and hoping you didn't accidentally grab a leech-infested one. The whole leeching business was oddly respectable, primarily because of the disastrous alternatives it offered. Bleeding was thought to balance the body's humors. If you didn't know, humors were essentially an ancient healthcare theory that posited the existence of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, and you were ill. So, what did doctors do when you had too much blood or phlegm? You guessed it, drain you until you feel better. If this were a job you could actually get paid for in 18th century Europe, you were in high demand. Need someone to help with a fever or relieve some head pressure? Call in the bloodletting expert, and don't forget the leeches. Historians still argue whether bloodletting actually worked, or if it was just a glorified way of weakening the patient enough for them to die eventually. Some suggest it was used to purify the body and restore balance, while others point out that bleeding just left you weak, dehydrated, and with a much higher chance of dying from blood loss. But one thing's for sure, this job was definitely not for the faint of heart. Imagine going around, sticking leeches to people, and watching them slowly fill up with someone's blood as if you were a dehydrated human sponge for their bodily fluids. Let's discuss the actual conditions for those involved in leeching. Suppose you were an assistant to a bloodletter or leech collector. In that case, you were constantly handling these slimy creatures, probably covered in sickening bodily fluids, and desperately hoping no one suddenly passed out while they were in the process of getting drained. You didn't get to sit back and watch the plump leeches do their work. You were right there in the trenches, holding on to those wriggling, slimy creatures and attaching them to unwilling victims. You weren't just an assistant. Asterisk, you were a full-on manager of blood, leeches, and probably some level of human misery. There's also the gross factor. Leeches are pretty disgusting creatures. Imagine catching them, storing them, and then using them on your customers. And don't forget, it wasn't as if the leeches were kept in clean water. Oh no, these guys were kept in whatever water source was available locally. Oh, I'm sure they're fine, right? A healthy mixture of bacteria, maybe a little fungus, and just the right amount of icky. Perfect for a sick patient. If they didn't kill you outright, they were supposed to make you feel better by sucking out the bad humors. You'd think someone in the 18th century might stop and ask, should we really be using these disgusting creatures for medical purposes? But nah. No one questioned anything back then, because that's how things worked. If the Romans did it, it must be good for us too. Historians still argue whether bloodletting was actually effective, or if it was just an excellent way for doctors to feel useful while draining you of precious life force. Some say that it worked for certain conditions, such as swelling or headaches, while others claim it was a surefire way to make a quick buck. But honestly, the idea of bleeding your body to balance your humors seems pretty sus in retrospect. You'd be better off just drinking some tea and lying down than letting some guy drain your blood into a bowl. Sick? Sure, let's make you sicker, why not? So, what could you do as a leech collector in the 18th century? Well, you could make a living, but you could never escape the gross factor of your job. You'd probably get some respect because you were part of the medical world, but you'd also be constantly up to your elbows in human fluids and bacteria-laden creatures. You might even get invited to the local court for your work, if you didn't accidentally kill someone. Either way, your career as a bloodletter assistant was bound to leave you with some serious stories to tell, even if you were too grossed out to recount them without dry heaving in the middle of your tale. Oh, we're really getting into it now, aren't we? The 18th century had some downright grim jobs, but none were quite as shockingly taboo as being the full-time executioner. You thought your boss was demanding? Try working for royalty and having the sole job of dispatching people at the drop of a hat, publicly, with a crowd gathered to watch. That's right, folks, the executioner's life wasn't filled with champagne and cheering crowds, unless, of course, you count the ones at your job. In fact, it was just the opposite. You were literally the person everyone loathed, and the only thank you got was when your axe fell, and you sent someone to the great beyond. And that was just the start of it. Before we dive into the gory details, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, by the way, comment your location and local time. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to be productive. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Let's set the scene. Picture this: the smell of burning wood in the air, a crowd murmuring in excitement, and there you are, the executioner, standing ready with your axe. What do you think you've signed up for? A job in government work? Nice paychecks and regular hours? Ha! No, the executioner's life was all about morbid spectacle. And the kicker? The executioner wasn't just some random guy who was forced to do this job. He was the job. You didn't get a second chance, and there was no, "Oh, I think I'll just take the day off." This was your whole career. You were hired to execute, to end lives, publicly, and the only thing that kept you in good standing was how well you did it. Get too slow with that axe, or miss the mark, and the public would never let you forget it. Historians still debate whether executioners were respected for their skill or viewed as mere hired hands carrying out the crown's dirty work. Some claim that executioners held a certain level of reverence. After all, they were considered necessary to uphold the law and ensure justice, or a warped version of it. Others, though, think the job left the executioner as an outcast, forced to live on the fringes of society, hated by all, and left with nothing but the shadows of the lives they took. In the end, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Executioners were feared and respected for their role, but not exactly invited to dinner parties. And let's not even get started on the psychological toll of being an executioner. You had to be able to separate yourself from the act, because if you didn't, you'd go crazy. Imagine taking someone's life for a living. No big deal, right? Just another day at the office. I mean, sure, you were following orders, but how morally right does it feel to chop off someone's head for breaking the law? Your job wasn't just hard because of the public spectacle, it was mentally draining because you had to constantly look someone in the eye and then, bam, take their life. The moral weight of that? Let's say it was a little heavier than your average 9 to 5. And that's not even considering the gruesome details of the job. You were expected to be efficient, precise, and quick. You couldn't mess around when someone's life was on the line. Miss the mark or be slow, and not only would the person die in agony, but the public would never let you forget it. The worst part? You could be executing someone for the simplest of crimes. Robbery, adultery, or even bad-mouthing the king. There wasn't much leniency. Justice was often swift and brutal. One day, you're chopping off a thief's head, and the next, you're delivering a punishment that could have been handed out to someone's cousin for breaking some minor rule. It wasn't just the heavy hand of justice that was brutal, it was the inconsistency. You could end up working for a king who enjoyed making public examples of people, or one who was a little more lenient, but either way, it wasn't a life anyone would choose unless they had no other options. So, what did the job actually look like? Gory. Imagine this, you're wearing heavy leather gloves, because, well, blood's going to fly, and your hands are going to get messy. You're at the chopping block, the crowd's gathered, and you need to make sure you hit the target with precision. And the worst part? You're standing in front of a whole crowd of people who are either cheering or jeering, depending on the crime. Every single movement matters. One slip, one mistake, and your reputation, and that of your king, goes down the drain. If the execution went badly, it could destroy your career and reputation for good. People didn't just forget poor executions. You could end up the laughingstock of the court, and your job would be on the line. Historians still debate whether executioners were ever truly troubled by the moral implications of their work. Some believe that they became numb to the deaths they caused over time, while others think they were deeply affected by the bloodshed. In either case, the truth remains, executioners had a tough job. They weren't just taking lives, they were living with the constant weight of being the instruments of royal wrath, and that's a lot for anyone to carry. No matter what, the executioner's job was as taboo as it got in the 18th century. There was no walking away from this career path with a clean conscience. So, what could you do as an executioner in 18th century Europe? Well, you could deliver swift justice, but that justice came with a price. A life lived in shadows, hated by the public, and forever marked by the blood on your hands. You might have been necessary, but you certainly weren't loved. And the worst part? Every time you took someone's life, you had to do it knowing that your next gig could be just as disastrous. Not exactly the life anyone dreams about. So you've made it through grave digging, sewage work, and bloodletting, and now it's time for the next level of nightmare fuel. Enter the rat catcher. Imagine it, 18th century Europe, the streets are filthy, the garbage is piled high, and naturally the rats are having the time of their lives. And guess who gets to deal with these rodent overlords? That's right, rat catchers. These brave, or perhaps desperate souls were tasked with hunting down, trapping, and killing the rats that were literally everywhere, and I mean everywhere. They weren't just in the sewers, they were in your homes, in your food supplies, and let's face it, they were probably in your bed too. Good times. Before you settle in, make sure you're subscribed, only if you're into dark history and disturbing job descriptions though. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're pretending to work while secretly binging on rat-induced horror stories. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. So, here's the situation. You're a rat catcher in 18th century Europe, and your job? Well, let's say, it's not all glamorous cat and mouse games. You're basically the first line of defense against an endless army of furry, disease-ridden invaders. The whole city is crawling with them. And it's not just about a few stray rats. Oh no, these are big rats, they travel in packs, and they're savage. These little beasts were known for gnawing on anything and everything, and I mean anything. Food supplies? Gone. The wooden beams of your house? Yeah, probably chewing through them too. And worst of all, they were known to spread diseases. So if you weren't careful, you could end up with a plague outbreak on your hands, thanks to your lovely friends on 4 legs. Now, let's talk about what it took to be a rat catcher. First of all, you had to be brave, and not the good kind of daring, the desperate kind. You needed to walk the streets in the middle of the night, likely armed with nothing but a net, a club, or maybe a dog trained to hunt them down. If you were really unlucky, you might have to use your hands. And we're not talking about any pristine, sanitized rat control. We're talking about getting into the thick of it, chasing rats into their holes, trying to get them into traps, and probably wading through trash piles and decaying food to get to them. No gloves. No fancy tools. Just you, some rusty traps, and maybe a rat terrier that could occasionally pull its weight. Historians still argue whether rat catchers were respected for the work they did or if they were considered the bottom of the barrel in the 18th century. Some think that they were necessary, but they certainly weren't appreciated. Sure, the people were glad to see the rats go, but no one was throwing a parade in their honor. Other historians suggest that, while the job was gross, rat catchers may have been highly valued in certain circles, especially during periods of common disease outbreaks. But in terms of social status? Yeah, no one was asking the rat catcher to sit at the royal table. No one was inviting them over to their house to share a glass of wine. They were the unsung heroes. No one cared, but without them, the rats would have won the war. But here's where it gets even nastier: the tools. You had to be equipped to deal with more than just pests. You were essentially handling contamination on your legs, and the rats were not going down without a fight. Some rat catchers carried rat poison, but you still had to deal with the bodies. Dead rats everywhere, hanging out of traps, scurrying through tunnels, or worse, popping up from your very own kitchen, which, let's face it, was probably right next to your rat-infested home. And don't forget about the rat-catching dogs. Some rat catchers had dogs that were specially trained to hunt the rodents. But the job wasn't glamorous for them either. These poor dogs would end up covered in blood, rat guts, and filth. You might think, hey, at least the dog is getting the glory. But nah, they were just as stuck in the muck as the human catchers. If that's not bad enough, let's add in disease. The rats weren't just a nuisance, they were dangerous. Plague outbreaks were common in the 18th century, and rats, along with their fleas, were often the main culprits. So, as a rat catcher, you had to contend with the possibility of contracting bubonic plague, typhus, and other nasty diseases. But did the job come with safety protocols in place? Ha! You didn't get health insurance or sick leave. If you caught something, it was on you. And here's the fun part: if a rat catcher died from the plague, they'd often be buried without ceremony, with no family or friends to mourn them, because let's be real, they were already social outcasts anyway. Historians debate whether rat catchers had any community support or if they were regarded as the lowest of the low. Some even think that the community didn't want to get too close for fear of catching the same disgusting diseases the rat catchers were exposed to. On the other hand, there was likely a sense of urgency to the job. Without these rat catchers, cities would have been overrun with vermin. But still, people weren't exactly lining up to shake their hands. So, what could you do as a rat catcher in the 18th century? Well, you could make a living, but it wasn't pretty. You'd spend your days battling rats, risking diseases, handling disgusting traps, and probably getting bitten more times than you'd like. Your life wouldn't be great, but hey, it paid the bills, until the plague brought to you. At the end of the day, you were the unsung hero no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone needed. Rats were everywhere, and you were the savior. In the grossest, most perilous way imaginable. Alright, hold on to your snacks, because we're about to wade through some of the nastiest muck you can imagine. You've heard of treasure hunters. In 18th century Europe, a distinct breed of treasure hunters emerged, the mudlarks. These were people who scoured the banks of rivers, scavenging through piles of filth, hoping to find something valuable. But let's be real, 90% of what they pulled out was garbage. Welcome to the glamorous world of mudlarking, where the treasure was more rotten meat than gold coins. But hey, sometimes they struck it rich, if you count a nice, shiny spoon or a half-broken pot as rich. Before we dive deeper into this swamp of a job, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you enjoy hearing about the lowest of the low when it comes to work. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Imagine yourself as a mudlark. You're knee-deep in river muck, pulling out anything you can find. Now, I'm not talking about polished artifacts from ancient times. No, no, no. Mudlarks were digging through layers of human waste, rotting animal carcasses, discarded shoes, and God knows what else to find a single coin or a scrap of something worth 2 pennies. You're digging through filth, standing in a river, knee-deep in sludge, and hoping for the best. Maybe you'll find something shiny, maybe not. But regardless, your feet are stuck in that gross mess for hours on end, and you're fighting off the stench while trying not to step on something that might bite you. Good times, right? Historians still debate whether mudlarks were considered valuable members of society or merely desperate scavengers. Some believe that in the bustling cities of the 18th century, mudlarks played a crucial role in clearing the debris that clogged the rivers. After all, when you have no modern trash collection system, someone has to sift through the mess to keep things from getting out of hand. Other historians point out that they were viewed as nothing more than dirty beggars with no fundamental skills or contributions to society. And honestly, the dirty beggar theory is more accurate because mudlarks were often pushed to the margins of society. Not exactly the type of person you'd bring home to meet your parents, unless your parents were into questionable hygiene and moral decisions. However, the kicker is that the job can be surprisingly profitable at times. Sometimes, a mudlark would pull out a shiny coin or even an old sword that had fallen into the river, treasure that had been lost years ago. Imagine the rush of pulling something out of that filthy water that's worth actual money. You probably felt like you just hit the jackpot, even though you'd spent half the day knee-deep in human excrement. Maybe you could even sell the coins you found to the local traders, but the real rewards were few and far between. Most days, you were pulling up rotting fish heads or broken pots, hardly the stuff of dreams. So, why keep doing it? Well, maybe it was because there was no better option. You were digging in the mud, not because you loved it, but because the alternatives were worse. And let's not forget that the conditions for these treasure hunters were downright grotesque. Mudlarks didn't get fancy gear or tools. They didn't even have proper footwear most of the time. You might be lucky to have a pair of boots that keep the muck from seeping in, but don't count on it. Chances are, you were walking barefoot through a mix of sewage, trash, dead animals, and whatever else the river had decided to throw up that day. No gloves, no face masks, and definitely no health insurance. If you got sick from standing in that swampy mess all day, good luck with that. There was no getting paid time off. If you didn't show up to work, you didn't eat. Simple as that. Historians debate whether mudlarks possessed specialized skills in their work or if they merely dug for trash without much strategy. Some argue that mudlarks had an uncanny ability to find valuable objects, making them seem like natural treasure hunters. Others think they were just desperate people who had no other means of survival. Either way, the job was gritty, unpleasant, and full of the kind of danger that we've come to associate with horror movies. Getting cut on something sharp, catching a nasty disease, or even getting sucked into the muck was part of the job. If you didn't watch where you stepped, the river itself could be your undoing. So, what could you do as a mudlark? Well, you could survive by scavenging in filthy rivers, hoping to find something worth a couple of coins, or maybe just an old pair of shoes to keep your feet from getting nasty. The job wasn't glamorous, and the rewards weren't always great, but it was a living. Kind of. It was an endurance game, digging through the muck, hoping for that one moment of treasure amidst a whole lot of nastiness. At least you weren't totally starving, though you were probably smelly enough for people to give you a wide berth. Oh, you thought the sewage workers and rat catchers had it bad? Wait till you hear about the tanners. They didn't just have to deal with the worst smells imaginable, they embraced it. In 18th century Europe, tanners were in charge of making leather out of the hides of animals. And if you've ever wondered what happens when you turn animal skin into durable leather, spoiler alert, it gets disgusting. We're talking about stinking pits of flesh, brains, and chemicals that made your average sewage pit look like a picnic by comparison. So, before you continue pretending that your job isn't so bad, hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you're prepared to smell the rotting mess of the 18th century. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to be productive. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Let's break down the glamorous life of an 18th century tanner. You were dealing with the smelliest, most disgusting job on the planet, and it was likely done in a pit where the only thing worse than the smell was the process. First, you had to soak the hides in stinking vats of urine and dung. Yes, urine. The scent of those vats could make a grown man weep, but you didn't get to stop there. You had to scrape off the flesh, scrape off the hair, and then treat the hides with oils, fats, and other substances to make sure they were suitable for leather goods. And if you think that was bad, wait until we talk about the brain treatment. For optimal leather, you used the brains of the animal to help preserve the hide. What a delight! Historians still debate whether tanners were considered essential to society or merely tolerated for their craft. On one hand, leather was everywhere in the 18th century: boots, belts, gloves, saddles, so the tanner's work was necessary. They were, after all, the ones turning raw, bloody hides into products that were crucial to survival and commerce. But on the other hand, they were constantly surrounded by rotting flesh, stinking fluids, and were often covered in dirt and the foulness of their craft. This, of course, led to their social status as outcasts who were not exactly invited to royal balls or fancy dinners. No, you weren't spending your nights at the opera. You were probably sitting alone, covered in the scent of animal waste and feeling thankful for the few pennies you were making for this very low-status job. But let's talk about the chemicals involved. You might think the worst part of tanning was dealing with the stench of urine and rotting animal remains, but oh no, you also had to deal with the dangerous chemicals used to preserve the leather. Many tanners suffered from severe health issues due to the toxic poisons they were exposed to. Lead and mercury were common in the tanning process, as they helped preserve the leather and make it pliable. But guess what? These substances weren't good for you. In fact, many tanners spent their lives suffering from mercury poisoning, lead poisoning, and a host of other diseases that could kill you slowly over time. It wasn't just about the smell, it was about poisoning yourself to make leather. Historians still debate whether tanners were aware of the risks associated with the chemicals they worked with, or whether it was simply a matter of necessity. Some believe tanners understood the dangers but kept working because they had no other option. After all, if you weren't working with leather, you weren't making money. Others think the process was so ingrained in daily life that no one thought to question it until decades later, when people started realizing that breathing in toxic fumes was probably not ideal for a long and happy life. Either way, tanners were essentially living on borrowed time. They worked with these chemicals, and even if they didn't get sick immediately, their bodies would eventually suffer the consequences. Additionally, tanners did not have the best living conditions either. The pits where they worked were often located near rivers or on the outskirts of towns, where the smell wouldn't drive people too crazy. But being near the river didn't always mean clean water. It just meant that you were constantly surrounded by filth, rotting animal parts, chemicals, and stench that was so bad it could practically warp your sense of smell. And let's not forget about the weather. If it was raining, the pits flooded, meaning your whole day was ruined. If it were too dry, your leather wouldn't be adequately preserved. It was a constant balancing act of working through dangerous conditions to make a living. So, what could you do as a tanner? Well, you could earn your keep, but at a steep price, literally. You were exposed to dangerous chemicals, lived in constant filth, and probably smelled like a walking carcass. You weren't a socialite or even a respectable craftsman. You were an essential outcast in the 18th century. You worked hard, but the job wasn't glamorous. You were a dirty worker, scraping, scrubbing, and curing animal hides for a living. You weren't going to change the world with your leather products, but you might have been responsible for keeping boots on the feet of soldiers marching into battle, or saddles on the backs of horses being ridden across Europe. And let's face it, if you survived, you probably didn't get much thanks from the public for your hard work. Alright folks, brace yourselves, because we're about to dive into one of the most horrifying jobs of the 18th century. It's time to talk about the chimney sweeps, those poor souls who spent their days, and sometimes their nights, crawling up narrow, soot-filled chimneys to clear the crud that had built up inside. And yes, spoiler alert, it wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was downright deadly. You've probably seen cute little chimney sweeps in movies or on the occasional vintage postcard, but let me burst that bubble, the reality was grim. Before you get too comfortable, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you're into death-defying jobs that make you want to run for the hills. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Let's set the scene. It's the 18th century, and chimneys are everywhere. Every house, every palace, every castle has a chimney, and that means there's a steady demand for those who are willing to clean them. So, what's the job? You're crawling into tight, dark spaces filled with soot, ash, and if you're lucky, just a few dead birds or rodents that got stuck. Oh, and don't forget about the smoke that's already embedded in the walls, clinging to everything like a second skin. You're not just climbing up a chimney for fun, you're literally shoveling out decades of debris, sometimes with nothing more than a small brush and a brush-like attitude. And to make things worse, chimneys in the 18th century were narrow, like impossibly narrow. In fact, many chimney sweeps were actually children, often no older than 6 or 7 years old, because their small bodies could fit into these cramped spaces more easily than those of adults. Historians still argue whether children were actively forced into chimney sweeping or if it was more of a desperate choice due to poverty. Some claim that parents had no other choice but to send their children into chimneys to make money, while others argue that some adults actively encouraged their kids to work in such dangerous conditions because it paid, even though kids could easily die in there. Either way, it's a job that came with no mercy. If you survived the narrow chimney spaces, the soot-filled lungs, and the risk of suffocation, you might be lucky enough to crawl out the top and climb your way to a decent meal. But let's face it, that wasn't always the case. If that doesn't gross you out enough, let's talk about the real danger, lung disease. As a chimney sweep, you were constantly exposed to coal dust and soot. And guess what? Those particles don't just get shaken off after a day's work. No, they stick to your lungs, your skin, your hair, for life. Over time, you could develop a chronic condition known as chimney sweeps disease, aka coal workers' pneumoconiosis, which is just a fancy way of saying lung cancer, but without the fancy diagnosis. Breathing in all that dust every single day, along with the carcinogens in the soot, meant that many chimney sweeps had short lifespans. Imagine working a job that could literally suffocate you over time. It was like a slow death sentence, one chimney at a time. Historians are still debating whether this was a necessary evil. After all, someone had to clean the chimneys in a time before modern heating systems, or if it was just an outright exploitation of children. Some say it was a widely accepted practice because everyone needed their chimneys cleaned, and there weren't many other job options available to low-income families. Others argue that it was nothing more than child labor at its worst, with children being forced to climb and squeeze into dangerous spaces where they were left vulnerable to burns, broken bones, and yes, death. These kids weren't just getting dirty, they were getting sick, injured, and often dying from their work. But here's the kicker, there wasn't any real alternative for these children. Without work, they couldn't eat. Without chimneys, there was no income, and without families willing to do whatever it took to survive, children found themselves in jobs like this, even if it meant a shortened life expectancy. Let's talk about the working conditions for a second, because they were worse than you think. For starters, the chimneys were often too small to move freely, meaning the sweeps would get stuck in the middle of their work. Sometimes, they'd have to crawl on their hands and knees, using nothing more than a brush or a scraper to remove soot, all while inhaling dangerous chemicals and fighting off claustrophobia. Worst case scenario? Suffocation from being trapped in a narrow passage, or falling from a dangerously high chimney. Not the kind of workplace safety we have in the modern world, right? So, what could you do as a chimney sweep in the 18th century? You could work your tiny fingers to the bone, or worse, get stuck in a chimney, all for a few pennies a day and a lifetime of lung issues to show for it. You weren't exactly becoming a legend in the process, but you were making sure people didn't freeze to death from the smoke building up in their homes. The job was miserable and dangerous, but there was little else for kids to do. If you survived the job, you were considered essential to keeping the city's hearths and homes functioning. Still, every day, you faced the reality that you could end up dead from smoke inhalation, diseases, or just getting stuck in a chimney shaft. Oh, and there were no health benefits or retirement packages for you. You were literally at the bottom of the social ladder, but hey, at least you were warm, right? Okay, folks, we've talked about rats, sewage, and even bloodletting, but now we're heading straight into nightmare territory. Imagine you're living in 18th century Europe and a plague hits. What do? You call for the plague doctor. Now, I know what you're picturing. Maybe some weirdly dressed guy in a long coat with a bird beak mask looking like a nightmare come to life. And you'd be right. But here's the kicker. The job of a plague doctor wasn't just creepy, it was straight up terrifying and pretty gross. They didn't have the luxury of modern medicine, and honestly, the mask wasn't there to protect you. It was there to protect them. But did it actually work? Well, that's up for debate. Spoiler alert. No, it didn't. Before you get too comfortable, hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you want to live in a world where plague doctors roam free. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to be productive. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Alright, let's break down what being a plague doctor was actually like. First of all, these individuals were responsible for handling plague outbreaks. That sounds important, right? Well, it was in theory. The thing is, they had no idea what they were actually dealing with. We're talking about people dying by the thousands in cities where hygiene was non-existent, rats were everywhere, and the medical tools were, well, let's say, not up to code. Plague doctors wore wide-brimmed hats, long coats made of waxed cloth, and of course, the distinctive birdbeak mask. Now, that mask wasn't just for spooky aesthetics. It was meant to protect the doctor from bad air, which they believed was the source of disease, not bacteria. They didn't know about germs back then. The mask was stuffed with herbs, spices, or even vinegar, to filter out the miasma, the foul air they thought caused the plague. Basically, it was a gross, terrible version of a gas mask, with no real protection from the actual disease. But hey, it looked cool, so at least they had that going for them. Historians still debate whether plague doctors were actually effective in combating the plague. Some argue that their presence was more about giving people some semblance of control over a disease that no one understood, while others think they were playing dress-up while people died. One thing is sure, despite their creepy appearance, these doctors were doing the best they could with the limited knowledge available to them at the time. They weren't murderers, but it's safe to say their treatments didn't exactly help much. Bloodletting, herbal remedies, and burying the sick under the floorboards, that's pretty much all they had to offer, and none of that was going to stop the plague from spreading. In fact, it probably made things worse. But in some ways, the plague doctor became a symbol of hope, a reminder that someone was trying to fight back against the disease, even if their efforts weren't exactly successful. You could probably find them wandering the streets in their ridiculous costumes, delivering the most useless advice, while people died around them. Weirdly, the ridiculousness of the outfit might have brought some comfort, because honestly, what else could you do in the face of a disease so powerful it wiped out entire populations? The plague doctor became your last hope, even if that hope was basically a man with a bird mask and a pocket full of herbs. And let's not forget the death toll of the plague itself. It wasn't just that people were dying, they were dying by the millions. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and cities became ghost towns as people fled in fear. And when the plague doctor showed up, it wasn't to save you, it was to inspect your illness and mark you for death if necessary. Those with the plague were usually quarantined, but in some cases, the plague doctor would declare them dead and leave them to die, which, yikes. The entire situation was a death sentence. The doctors might have looked the part, but that didn't mean they had any real solutions. The actual remedies they used, such as draining blood, urine baths, and herbal concoctions, were more likely to weaken the patient than to aid in recovery. Historians still debate whether the plague doctor's role was ever really about curing the plague or if it was more about managing the crisis. Some believe the doctors were doing their best to save as many people as possible with the knowledge available to them at the time. Others think they were pushing through without actually understanding the cause of the disease, and as a result, they were exacerbating the situation. So, what could you do as a plague doctor? Well, you could wear an absurd outfit, get paid a little for your trouble, and try to heal people with herbs, concoctions, and rituals that had no effect. Your job was futile, but it made you feel like you were at least doing something. You had a mask, you had the coat, and you had zero understanding of how germs actually work. But at least you looked the part, and in the middle of a pandemic, that might have been the best you could do. Alright, if you thought being a rat catcher or plague doctor was bad, it's time to take a deep breath because we're about to step into a job that's as terrifying as it is unforgiving: the debt collector. Imagine this: you've fallen behind on your payments, and suddenly, there's a knock at the door. Who is it? A debt collector, and he's there to collect what's rightfully owed. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, not exactly. These debt collectors weren't just making a few polite phone calls asking for payment. They were hardcore, in-your-face enforcers who literally collected what was owed through threats, intimidation, and in some cases, violence. Oh, and don't forget about the bad reputation they had, because these folks weren't exactly the life of the party. Let's dive into the world of 18th century debt collection. And trust me, it's nothing like what you see on TV. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, hit that like button and subscribe. Only if you're into terrifying, morally questionable jobs from the past. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Debt collectors in the 18th century weren't just about sending letters or holding polite meetings. Oh no, they had to get down and dirty, tracking down debtors, demanding payment, and making sure that the money got into the right hands, no matter what. They were the enforcers of the financial system, and they often had no patience for excuses. If you owed someone money, it was their responsibility to ensure you paid up. And if you didn't? Well, there were consequences. You might get dragged into court, have your property seized, or even be imprisoned until you can pay your debt. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real danger was when a debt collector came to your door, and things didn't go as smoothly as expected. Historians still debate whether debt collectors were viewed as necessary enforcers of the law or if they were merely legal thugs with a badge. Some say that they were doing their job, ensuring that people paid back what they owed. Others, however, point out that debt collectors were often cruel, using intimidation and force to get what they wanted. In fact, physical violence was a real possibility if you couldn't pay your debt. Imagine opening your door to a man who was legally allowed to take your property, beat you into submission, or even put you in prison. All because you were a few coins short. The reality of dealing with debt collectors in the 18th century was a lot less civilized than today's collection calls. But here's where it gets really terrifying. These debt collectors didn't just have a legal right to come after you. The government or wealthy creditors often backed them. This meant they had unlimited resources to track you down, arrest you, or even sell your assets to get what was owed. You could be publicly shamed for not paying your debts, your name plastered on posters, and your reputation ruined in front of the whole community. And it wasn't just the rich folk who faced the wrath of the debt collectors. The poor were at serious risk, too. If you couldn't make a living or support your family, you could find yourself on the wrong side of the law just because you borrowed money and couldn't pay it back. Yikes. Now, let's talk about the psychological toll of being a debt collector. These people weren't just taking money, they were destroying lives in the process. They were feared, hated, and often treated like scum by the general public. And to be honest, it makes sense. Imagine waking up every day and knowing that your job involved breaking the spirit of people who were already struggling to get by. You didn't get to be the nice guy, you were the one everyone hated, and that didn't exactly make you a local hero. In fact, it often made you a villain, someone who couldn't be trusted, and someone people actively avoided. You weren't there to help people. Your job was to make sure they paid up or suffered the consequences. Historians still debate whether debt collectors were essential to society or just a necessary evil, a tool used to maintain financial order. Some claim that without them, people would avoid paying their debts, while others think they were nothing more than enforcers of a corrupt system that allowed the rich to oppress the poor. Either way, there was little sympathy for debt collectors. They were the ones who took everything from people who were already at rock bottom. They weren't heroes. They were the ones who ensured that no one escaped their financial obligations, even if that meant ruining someone's life in the process. So, what could you do as a debt collector in the 18th century? Well, you could collect money, but you'd never be popular, and you'd probably live in constant fear of retaliation. People weren't going to invite you to their parties or dinner tables. They were more likely to lock their doors when they saw you coming down the street. Your job wasn't just dirty, it was dangerous, and it came with no empathy. You weren't there to be friends, you were there to get what was owed, no matter the cost. And the worst part? Once you'd done the deed, you didn't get to walk away with applause. No, instead, you had to go home knowing that your actions ruined lives and made you the most hated person in your town. Fun, right? Alright, Time to meet the original news anchor. No, not the ones with their perfect hair and pristine suits reading off teleprompters in a comfy studio. I'm talking about criers. These individuals were the loudspeakers of the 18th century, tasked with delivering essential announcements in a world that lacked TVs, radios, and smartphones. Think about it. If you wanted to know about the king's new decree, or the latest gossip, or perhaps the price of bread, you had to wait for the town crier to show up and scream it at you. That's right, this wasn't your quiet newspaper delivery. This was about shouting in the streets, making sure everyone heard the most crucial or ridiculous news in town. Before you grab your snacks, make sure to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy loud, annoying morning announcements. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Imagine living in a time when word of mouth was the primary means of spreading news. That's where the town criers came in. They'd stroll through the streets, bells clanging and all, shouting whatever the hell the local government or wealthy merchants wanted you to know. News about the latest executions, or that a flood had taken over the town's market, or that the price of cabbage was skyrocketing, was all passed down by these brave individuals. Now, you'd think these criers had a glamorous gig, right? You get to be loud, you get attention. Everyone listens to you. But hold up, because this job was no walk in the park. You weren't just standing there with a megaphone reading off scripts. You had to constantly yell through crowds of people who were probably trying to get to the butcher without hearing about the king's latest temper tantrum. Historians still debate whether criers were viewed as essential figures in their communities or merely a necessary evil. Some believe they were appreciated. After all, they were the ones who kept everyone informed, even if it was about something as pointless as the town's new law banning goats on Tuesdays. Others think criers were just annoying loudmouths who made it impossible to enjoy a peaceful morning. You couldn't even step outside to get fresh air without hearing "hear ye," blasting from some dude with a drum and a bell. Imagine that on repeat, every day at the crack of dawn. And let's not forget that criers were tasked with announcing some pretty terrifying things, like public punishments or news of a plague outbreak, pretty much ruining your day before you even had your first cup of gruel. But here's where it gets even crazier. The physical toll of being a crier wasn't a joke. This wasn't some whispered delivery from behind a desk. No. These criers had to shout at the top of their lungs, often for hours on end, without much of a break. You thought the town criers had it easy? Try walking through a crowded street, yelling for everyone's attention while wearing the official town crier uniform, complete with a bell that clanged loudly every time you took a step. You were like a walking alarm that no one could turn off, just blaring information at the top of your lungs for hours, getting paid maybe a few pennies for it. And the worst part? No matter how tired you were, you couldn't stop. If the bells stopped ringing, or if you weren't loud enough, no one would hear the news. And God forbid you miss a big announcement. You'd probably get fired on the spot and replaced by someone who could yell louder. It's a job that requires absolute dedication to loud noises. And then, there's the quality of the news. You didn't always get the best material to announce. Sometimes, you were delivering the king's nonsense about a new law nobody cared about, or other times, you were passing on gossip that might be completely fabricated. The issue with being a crier wasn't just about yelling. It was about delivering whatever the authorities gave you, even if it was total garbage. But did you have a choice? Of course not. You had to yell what was written down, or else your job was on the line. Imagine being that guy who has to announce that all cows will now wear red ribbons. That's your life now. Enjoy the fame, pal. Historians debate whether criers ever took pride in their work. Some think they were seen as necessary, respectable figures. After all, they were the ones keeping society connected through communication. Others argue that they were just annoying peasants who had to yell things they probably didn't even care about. Either way, the job was loud, grueling, and often involved delivering the worst possible news. You were essentially a walking bad news messenger, someone who got all the angst but none of the glory. You were neither the hero nor the villain. You were the guy who yelled a lot, got sweaty, and was probably hated by the general population. Good times. So, what could you do as a town crier in 18th century Europe? Well, you could earn a living by being the loudest person in the street, but you'd also be the least popular person around. No one wanted to hear you shout about every little thing, and they definitely didn't want to listen to it at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. Everyone probably hated you, but hey, you were keeping the streets informed, even if it was about the governor's new hat or the annual goose-stealing contest. If nothing else, your work was essential to keeping everyone in the loop, and that's something, right? Right? Alright, if you think the life of a town crier or plague doctor was tough, wait until you hear about the shovelers, the true heroes of the 18th century garbage battle. Imagine this. You're living in a crowded, overpopulated European city where waste management isn't a thing, and the streets are basically one giant garbage heap that people are too lazy or disorganized to clean up. The stench of rotting food, animal carcasses, and human waste fills the air. And who's there to clean up the mess? The shovelers, the unsung garbage warriors who had to shovel the streets clear of filth to prevent disease outbreaks, riots, and overall absolute chaos. Before you start thinking your job's bad, make sure you like and subscribe. Only if you love hearing about jobs that will make you never complain about your work again. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. So, what exactly does being a shoveler entail? Picture yourself walking down the street in your work boots, surrounded by mountains of trash. You've got your trusty shovel in hand, and you're tasked with cleaning up everything from animal waste to rotting food, along with the occasional dead rat or human remains. Indeed, the 18th century had its own unique waste management issues, and it wasn't just trash, it was a biohazardous nightmare. So, in comes the shoveler, whose job was to move it all out of sight and pray that the plague didn't spread. You couldn't just hire a sanitation crew to clean up. It was a manual labor nightmare where your primary tool was a shovel and your secondary tool was a strong stomach. The job wasn't about making the streets look pretty, it was about keeping the disease from devouring the city. Because let's face it, if people had to step through piles of excrement to get to their local bakery, things were bound to go sideways. Historians still argue about the status of these garbage warriors. Were shovelers seen as necessary workers keeping the streets clean and the population alive, or were they just the filthy outcasts of society who had to deal with the mess no one else wanted? Some believe they were essential, even if they were viewed as lowly, while others think they were ignored by everyone except the rich folks who didn't want to see garbage piles growing outside their houses. Either way, these shovelers were vital to the survival of any European city. Without them, the streets would have been nothing but rotting waste, and people would have died faster than they could have eaten their next meal. Imagine living in a place where you could be walking in human waste, food scraps, or even worse, dead bodies. And no one was doing a thing about it until the shovelers came in to clean up. But let's talk about the real risks of being a shoveler. First of all, disease. You couldn't precisely avoid catching whatever plague or infection was going around when you were spending your day shoveling through disease-ridden piles of filth. These weren't just piles of trash, these were walking breeding grounds for all sorts of infections. You were literally in the middle of everything nasty. And did you get protection? Of course not. No masks, no gloves, and definitely no vaccinations. You didn't even have basic hygiene. Your best bet for avoiding sickness was probably hoping you wouldn't step on anything that would bite you. And let's not even get started on the smell. You'd go home every night with your clothes reeking of rotting food and human waste, and let's say that was no fragrance of the year. The smell was so bad that you'd probably become numb to it over time, but it would stick to you for days, weeks, maybe longer. Who needed air fresheners when you had the shoveler's stench following you wherever you went? Then, there were the working conditions. The streets were filthy, the garbage piles were enormous, and the tools? Well, you didn't exactly get a sophisticated sanitation kit. You had a shovel and your wits, and that was it. You'd dig through rotting meat, human waste, broken glass, and anything else that found its way onto the street, all while fighting the stench of death that hung in the air like a shadow. And guess what? If you didn't clean it all up by the end of the day, you could be punished. So no pressure, right? You had to clean up as quickly as possible, while avoiding getting sick, and somehow finish before the next wave of filth hit. Oh, and if you missed a spot? The whole town would know, and you'd be the talk of the streets for your failure. Let's say, being a shoveler wasn't exactly the high life. Historians still debate whether shovelers were actually respected or merely exploited laborers who had no choice but to undertake the grim work. Some believe they were seen as crucial figures who kept the streets clean and protected the public, while others suggest that they were simply unseen, unappreciated workers who were left to deal with the filth of a city that didn't care about their well-being. Regardless of how society saw them, the reality was that someone had to deal with it. Someone had to ensure the piles of waste didn't bury everyone alive. And while the shovelers didn't get a thank you or a reward, their job was undoubtedly vital to the functioning of any city. So, what could you do as a shoveler in 18th century Europe? You could make a living, but the pay wasn't much, the conditions were horrendous, and the risks were high. You were low on the totem pole in terms of social status, and your job came with an unspoken curse. You were forever associated with dirt, disease, and the things people didn't want to talk about. But without you, the streets would have been a nightmare. You were the invisible first responder to the crisis that nobody wanted to see but everyone needed to avoid. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary, and if you survived the stench and the risks, you could keep the wheels of the city turning, one shovelful at a time. If you thought shoveling through the muck and filth of 18th century Europe was as grim as it got, I'm afraid we're about to turn things up a notch, straight into the bones of the issue. Welcome to the world of bone pickers. Yes, you read that correctly. In a time when bodies were constantly piling up, either from disease, war, or the general lack of any decent healthcare, some very enterprising, read desperate, individuals figured out a way to make a living by salvaging bones from mass graves and battlefields. Their goal? To reclaim the bones for use in everything from jewelry and buttons to medieval trinkets. Think of it as the 18th century's version of upcycling, except, it was dead people instead of used furniture. Before you hit the back button, take a second to like and subscribe. Only if you want to hear about jobs that will make you question everything about the history of civilization. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to be productive. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. So, let's talk about the job description of a bone picker. These folks were not your average scavengers. They didn't just go around digging through trash. No, they were digging through bodies. Picture this: after a war, a plague, or some other death-related event, a massive number of corpses would be discarded in mass graves or hastily buried. But the bones? They weren't just going to sit there and rot. Someone needed to dig them up, clean them, and make them useful again. And guess who was taking on that delightful task? That's right, the bone pickers. Now, let's not romanticize this job. It wasn't about polished relics or some cute little artisan market where bone jewelry was being sold to noble families. No. Bone pickers had to deal with the stench of decaying bodies, the rotten remains, and the infections that were likely to come with the territory. Imagine unearthing bones that had been buried in the ground for years, maybe covered in rot, disease, and decay. These people were literally digging through human remains for a living, often without any protection against the diseases they were likely to catch. And let's not forget the unspeakable risks they took while scraping bones off freshly exhumed bodies. In an age where medicine was a guessing game, those who worked with dead bodies were putting their own health in serious jeopardy. Historians still argue whether bone pickers were justifiably working to recycle valuable materials or if they were exploiting the dead for their own financial gain. Some say that they were performing a necessary service to extract bones, which could be used to create buttons, jewelry, tools, and even occasional furniture ornaments. Others point out that they were literally profiting from human suffering and the discarded remains of those who had been forgotten by society. Either way, these folks weren't getting invited to society's galas. They were digging up dead people's bones and then trading them for pennies, while probably dealing with more psychological trauma than any therapist could fix. However, let's discuss the aftermath of their work. Imagine the chaos surrounding the mass graves of the time. There were wars everywhere, with soldiers dying and being thrown into pits without ceremony. And then there was the plague, where bodies were tossed into unmarked graves as towns tried to contain the disaster. The bone pickers arrived after all that death and began their work. Think about it, you're handling the remains of thousands of people who died from some horrific illness or war. You're not exactly working with clean, fresh bones. Nope, these bones were decaying and often still had traces of flesh or blood on them. The psychological toll on a bone picker must have been enormous. Every day you wake up, grab your tools, and head to a graveyard or battlefield, where you're about to pull apart the remnants of people's lives for a few coins. It's not like you could even afford to ignore it. This was your livelihood. And God forbid you got attached to the bones of the people you were picking, because, well, they were just bones, but it was easy to imagine the people they once were. The psychological burden must have been incredible. How do you go about your day, scraping the flesh from bones, knowing that these were someone's fathers, mothers, children? And on top of all that, you had to deal with the fact that you were doing this to survive, not because it was glamorous or rewarding. Historians debate whether bone pickers were more than just scavengers, whether they were truly contributing to society or just profiting off human remains in a morally questionable way. Some argue that they were just another form of labor in a world where people had few options for survival. Others point out that bone picking wasn't just about survival, it was about taking advantage of death for personal gain. Either way, bone pickers were vital to specific industries, creating items such as buttons, jewelry, and tools from the bones they collected. It's just hard to imagine a job that was both necessary and deeply uncomfortable at the same time. But in a world where survival depended on every possible resource, bone pickers were doing what they had to do to make ends meet. So, what could you do as a bone picker? Well, you could scrape bones from dead bodies, clean them up, and use them to create something useful, but that came at a considerable cost. Your job would be morally questionable at best, psychologically damaging at worst. You weren't exactly getting rich off this gig, but you could make a living. Don't ask for any social respect while you're at it. And at the end of the day, you'd have the satisfaction of knowing that you were digging up human remains and turning them into something valuable. But let's face it, no one would want to buy you a drink after hearing about your workday. You think you've heard it all by now, right? Grave diggers, plague doctors, rat catchers. Surely, there's no more darkness to uncover. But when you thought it couldn't get any worse, here comes the coffin maker. In the 18th century, death was a daily reality. Whether from the plague, warfare, or just the general terrible hygiene of the time, people didn't exactly live to a ripe old age. And who was responsible for sending the dead to their final resting places? The coffin maker. Imagine having the morbid task of constructing the boxes that would eventually hold the bodies of those who had passed. Sounds grim, right? Well, strap in, because it gets even more disturbing. Before you take off, hit the like button and subscribe. Only if you enjoy diving into the grosser side of history though. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. Let's set the scene. It's the 18th century, and your job as a coffin maker is to build the final resting place for the dead, one pine box at a time. You'd think a job like this would be easy, right? Just cut a few planks, hammer them together, and voila. Well, not so fast. Firstly, the materials you're working with weren't of the highest quality. You're not getting rich mahogany or luxury wood here. No, you're usually working with cheap pine or oak, and most of the time, it's warped or brittle from the poor storage conditions. And don't even get me started on the tools. Forget your electric saws or power drills. You've got a handsaw, a mallet, and maybe a few nails if you're lucky. Oh, and good luck with that finished product, because when it comes to the deceased, you want everything to fit just right, but sometimes you're working with bodies that were unexpectedly bloated or decomposed by the time they reached you. This is a job that involved precision, in the worst way possible. Historians still debate how coffin makers were seen in the 18th century. Some suggest that they were considered respectable artisans because they worked in a trade that honored the dead. Others, however, argue that the work was morbid and that coffin makers were treated with indifference, kind of like undertakers today. You were seen as necessary, but not valuable. People needed their coffins, but no one really wanted to talk to the guy who made them. Imagine trying to get small talk at a party when you specialize in building wooden boxes for the dead. Yeah, people weren't exactly lining up to ask you about your latest creations. Now, let's dive into the grim details of the job. Not only were you making boxes for dead people, but you were also often called upon to prepare the bodies for burial. You had to know how to handle decomposing bodies. You had to fit the body properly into the box, which could involve pushing, prodding, and sometimes even slicing off parts of the body to make everything fit just right. And guess what? You weren't exactly getting a lot of medical training for this. This wasn't a delicate embalming process. It was simply getting the body into a box before it started to decay further. You think the body odor was foul for everyone else at the funeral? Well, imagine being the one who had to arrange the bodies, knowing they were already beginning to rot. Not exactly a fun day at work. And don't forget about the public aspect of your job. In the 18th century, funerals were not quiet, somber affairs. They were public spectacles. People would gather around the coffin in the street, watching the body being prepared for burial. And, as the coffin maker, you weren't exactly blending into the background. No, you were right there, in front of the crowd, fixing the box and making sure the dead were contained adequately for their journey into the afterlife. Imagine having a crowd of people stare at you while you hammer together a box that's about to hold someone's loved one. It's not exactly the high point of your career, unless, of course, you had a crowd of people paying you for your work. In that case, maybe you were doing well, but the emotional weight of your task was always there. People didn't want to talk about death, but they needed you to make sure their dead relatives were correctly handled. Historians still debate whether coffin makers were compensated well for their grim work. Some believe that, because coffins were essential for burial, these craftsmen made a steady living. But others argue that coffin makers were just one step above the gravedigger, in terms of social respect. People needed them, but they were still low on the social ladder. Even though they were dealing with the dead, they weren't exactly rich or respected. Coffin makers did essential work. After all, a city couldn't function without a proper burial system, but they were still the ones who were stuck in the muck, handling dead bodies for a living. So, what could you do as a coffin maker in 18th century Europe? Well, you could earn a living by making boxes for the dead, but it wasn't exactly pleasant work. You spent your days hammering wood, dealing with decomposing bodies, and being socially avoided by everyone you met. Your job was essential, but no one wanted to thank you for it. People needed their coffins, but no one really wanted to talk to the person who made them. Still, you had a job to do, and you did it well, if only because it was the last thing you could do for the dead before they passed on to the next life. You thought we were done with the discomfort. Well, you're wrong. Time to close out this grim journey with one of the most taboo, underground, and downright dirty jobs of the 18th century, prostitution, and the people behind it, brothel keepers. In the 18th century, the demand for pleasure didn't exactly take a holiday. While people in high society were hosting fancy balls and sipping tea, the people running the business of sex were in a much grimmer line of work. Prostitutes were often the most invisible members of society. Working in brothels or on the streets, their lives dictated by exploitation, poverty, and public scorn. The brothel keeper, on the other hand, was the businessperson in this world, managing the operations, profiting from the system, and often living a life of wealth while everyone else was trying to survive. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy diving into the darker side of history. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. So, what did being a prostitute in the 18th century entail? Well, it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even respectable. Prostitutes in the 18th century were generally seen as the lowest of the low, not much more than objects for the pleasure of wealthy men, and sometimes women. The job itself was full of danger, abuse, and stigma. There was little to no protection for these women, either from disease, violence, or exploitation. It's not like they had the luxury of a day off or the ability to refuse a client who was abusive or violent. If you were a prostitute, you were at the mercy of the men who paid for your services. Historians still debate whether prostitutes in the 18th century had any agency or whether they were just victims of their circumstances. Some argue that many prostitutes volunteered for the work because they had no other option. It was better than starving, and at least it provided them with some level of survival. Others suggest that prostitution in the 18th century was more of a trap, a vicious cycle that women got stuck in because of poverty, social stigma, and a lack of opportunity. Either way, the women in this profession lived lives marked by violence, disease, and constant degradation. The men who came to visit them weren't exactly there to respect them. They were looking to get their fix, and once they had their pleasure, they left, often without a second thought about the woman they'd just used. But the brothel keeper, the person running the show, they were the ones profiting from this entire system. Brothel keepers were the managers, the ones who controlled the operations and made the money. They were the ones who found clients, took a cut of the earnings, and kept things running smoothly, while also taking on most of the risk. These brothel keepers often led luxurious lives compared to the women they managed. They controlled the women, decided who could come and go, and took the profits from their suffering. While prostitutes were constantly at risk of disease, violence, or even death, the brothel keeper made sure they stayed at arm's length from the dangers, all while collecting money. The brothel keeper was often seen as the face of this grim business, running a place of debauchery but also making sure everything stayed just tidy enough to avoid any serious trouble with the law. And let's not forget about the legal gray area surrounding brothels. In many places, prostitution wasn't exactly illegal, but brothels were often subject to heavy regulation. In some cities, brothel keepers were required to register their businesses and pay taxes to stay open. They had to keep records of their prostitutes, ensuring that each woman had a permit and was checked for diseases. It wasn't exactly fun, but it was a way for brothel keepers to manage their business without risking it all by getting shut down. This system was not just about pleasure, it was about business, and it was dirty business at that. The women worked the front lines, while the brothel keeper collected the profits, keeping their hands clean while others paid the price. Historians still argue whether brothel keepers were seen as respected members of society or if they were hiding behind the scenes as the real culprits in a morally questionable system. Some think brothel keepers were business people, just doing what they had to do to survive, while others argue that they were the ones exploiting everyone around them. Either way, these people lived in a world of secrecy, shame, and risk, but they still managed to carve out lives of luxury off the backs of their workers. They were the ones profiting from the most taboo business in the 18th century, all while staying as far from the consequences as possible. So, what could you do as a brothel keeper or a prostitute in 18th century Europe? As a prostitute, you could survive by providing a service that people needed, but at the cost of your dignity, your health, and your freedom. You were often rejected by society, shunned by your peers, and stuck in a cycle of abuse and exploitation. As a brothel keeper, you could make a decent living off the bodies of others, but you had to live with the knowledge that your wealth was built on a foundation of suffering, and that your business was one step away from scandal. Either way, you were involved in the most shameful profession of the time, whether you were the one providing the service or the one profiting from it. As we reach the end of this dark journey through the most taboo jobs in 18th century Europe, let's take a moment to reflect on just how grim things really were. From the suffocating grimness of grave diggers to the terrifying business of debt collectors and the unthinkable work of bone pickers, it's clear that life back then wasn't about convenience or comfort. These people lived lives filled with constant struggle, often working in environments that were physically dangerous, psychologically traumatic, and morally questionable. But despite the hardships, these workers, whether brothel keepers making a living off human suffering or shovelers scraping through piles of filth, were, in some cases, the unsung heroes of society. They did the work that no one else wanted to do. They risked their lives, their health, and their dignity to make sure that the wheels of society kept turning, no matter how much the system exploited them. They were the ones who kept the streets clean, built the coffins, paid the debts, and buried the bodies. No thanks, no reward, and indeed no glory, just the knowledge that they were the ones making sure the city didn't completely fall apart. So next time you're stuck in your office, stressing about traffic or your emails, remember, at least you're not a rat catcher, shoveling through piles of human waste, or scraping bones off a battlefield. We may have our own challenges, but we certainly don't have to worry about stepping into the kind of muck these workers did. Sweet dreams, folks, and if you're still awake, remember, at least no one asked you to clean up after a plague outbreak today.